November 6th, 1895. Morning light fell through stained glass windows at St. Thomas Church in New York City. 300 policemen lined the street outside, thousands of spectators pressed against barriers. Inside, cream of society watched a 17-year-old bride approach the altar. Behind her veil, Consuelo Vanderbilt wept. The groom arrived late. Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, had been conducting final negotiations, squeezing more money from the Vanderbilt fortune. The final price was $2.5 million in railroad stock, equivalent to $94 million today, plus $100,000 annual income for life. The bride's mother had forced the marriage. The groom needed the money to save Blenheim Palace from ruin. Neither bride nor groom loved each other. Both were in love with other people. This marriage was a transaction, dollars for dukedom, American wealth for British title. If you enjoy investigations into British aristocracy and the costs behind grand estates, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which palace to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let us begin. The palace that would consume fortunes and destroy marriages began not as a home but as a war memorial. John Churchill was born in 1650 in Devon to a family of minor gentry. Not wealthy, not powerful, simply connected enough to place him in royal service. In 1678, Churchill married Sarah Jennings, an attendant to Princess Anne. This marriage would prove more important than anyone imagined. Sarah was clever, forceful, ambitious. She befriended the young princess completely. When Anne became queen in 1702, Sarah wielded enormous influence over both personal and political decisions. John Churchill's military career flourished during the War of the Spanish Succession. In 1704, at the Battle of Blenheim in Bavaria, Churchill commanded Allied forces against the French and Bavarians. The battle was decisive. Marshal Tallard surrendered. The French threat to Vienna evaporated. Britain's position in Europe strengthened dramatically. Churchill had won one of the war's most important victories. Queen Anne elevated him to Duke of Marlborough. Parliament voted him rewards befitting a national hero. The rewards were extraordinary. The Queen gave Churchill the royal manor of Woodstock in Oxfordshire, 1,500 acres of former royal hunting ground. The site included ruins of a medieval palace where Henry II had kept his mistress, Fair Rosamond. The land came with peppercorn rent, one French flag to be presented annually on the anniversary of Blenheim. Parliament voted funds for building a palace, not just a house. A palace, a monument to British military triumph. A building that would announce to Europe that Britain had arrived as a great power, the precise responsibility for funding. This palace has never been resolved. The palace, as reward, was discussed within months of Blenheim. Everyone agreed that a grateful nation led by its queen wished to give their national hero a suitable home. But the exact size and nature of that house remained vague. A warrant dated 1705, signed by Parliamentary Treasurer the Earl of Godolphin, appointed an architect and outlined his remit. Unfortunately for the Churchills, nowhere did this warrant mention Queen or Crown. This error would provide the escape clause when costs escalated. The Duke contributed £60,000 to initial costs when work commenced in 1705. Parliament supplemented this with additional funds. Together, this should have built a monumental house. Should have. Parliament voted funds for building Blenheim, but no exact sum was mentioned. No provision for inflation, no allowance for expenses beyond budget. Almost from the outset, funding was spasmodic. Queen Anne paid something, but with growing reluctance and frequent lapses following her constant arguments with Duchess Sarah. The architect selected for this ambitious project was controversial. Duchess Sarah wanted Sir Christopher Wren, famous for St. Paul's Cathedral and many other national buildings. The Duke, following a chance meeting at a playhouse, commissioned Sir John Vanbrugh there and then. Vanbrugh was a popular dramatist, but an untrained architect. He usually worked with the trained and practical Nicholas Hawksmoor. The duo had recently completed early stages of Castle Howard in Yorkshire, one of England's first buildings in flamboyant European Baroque style. The Duke was impressed by this grandiose style and wanted something similar at Woodstock. Sarah was not impressed. She had been foiled in her wish to employ Wren. She would never forgive Vanbrugh for this. But the commission was awarded. Work began. What followed was 17 years of construction, marked by political infighting, funding collapses, bitter quarrels, and ultimately, tragedy. The building process that began in 1705 would not end until 1722. By then, the Duke would be dead, the architect would be banned from the site, the costs would be ruinous, and the palace would stand as both triumph and disaster. Vanbrugh designed with breathtaking ambition and radical vision. The palace would not be a single building, but an entire complex, resembling a fortified city. 3 massive blocks arranged around courtyards. The centre block contained living quarters and staterooms where the Duke and his family would reside and receive guests. 2 flanking rectangular wings, each built around its own central courtyard, provided service functions. 1 entire wing contained stables for dozens of horses, rooms for grooms, storage for carriages, and tack. The other wing housed kitchens vast enough to feed hundreds, laundries with equipment for washing linens from 187 rooms, storehouses for provisions, and accommodation for servants. The design drew inspiration from multiple sources, creating something uniquely English yet internationally informed. English medieval fortifications provided the military bearing. Vanbrugh originally wished to call it Blenheim Castle, not Palace, emphasizing its fortress quality. Classical rhythms learned from Christopher Wren gave proportion and balance to the composition. The exuberance of great Italian and French Baroque palaces, buildings Vanbrugh had seen during his travels and imprisonment in France, provided theatrical drama. The result was English Baroque at its most definitive and powerful. If Castle Howard was dramatic assembly of restless masses, Blenheim was altogether more solid, more permanent, more intimidating. The massive blocks relied on tall, slender windows to lighten the mass of yellow bathstone. Monumental statuary crowned the roofline, silhouettes visible for miles across Oxfordshire countryside. The east gate, set in the curtain wall of the service block, created an illusion of greater height through tapering walls. This gate also served as water tower for the palace, demonstrating that Vanbrugh's designs, whatever the Duchess claimed, combined beauty with function. The Grand Bridge in the forecourt would eventually cross 3 canals, though later these would be submerged beneath Capability Brown's Lake. The building was first projected to cost around £100,000. This estimate proved catastrophically inadequate. At least 3 times that amount was spent during the main building phase from 1705 to 1712 alone. 1,500 workmen were employed at peak construction. The logistics were staggering. Stone had to be quarried at Bath, 115 miles away, then transported by wagon to nearest waterway, loaded onto barges, shipped along canals and rivers to points near Oxford, then carted overland to Woodstock. Each block of Bath stone travelled days to reach the building site. Weather delays were constant. Floods stopped barge traffic. Mud made roads impassable. Frost cracked stone before it could be installed. Timber was hauled from English forests and imported from Baltic ports. Oak for framing, pine for floors, mahogany for fine joinery. Lead came from mines in Derbyshire for roofing and plumbing. Iron for structural supports, brass for fixtures, copper for gutters and downspouts, glass from manufactories transported carefully to avoid breakage. Each material required separate sourcing, separate contracts, separate transport arrangements. Managing procurement occupied full-time staff. Craftsmen arrived from across Britain and Europe. Italian plasterers created ceiling decorations of extraordinary complexity. French furniture makers supplied pieces of quality matching anything in Versailles. British craftsmen provided mahogany doors, window frames, floor parquet. German metal workers created brass fixtures, door handles, window latches. The finest skills available were employed, and each craftsman commanded wages appropriate to his mastery. The payroll alone consumed thousands of pounds monthly. The Great Hall rose 67 feet high, immense space serving merely as vast anteroom to state apartments beyond. Stone carvings by Grinling Gibbons, England's finest woodcarver, decorated surfaces throughout. Gibbons created garlands of fruits and flowers, trophies of arms, classical figures, all from stone that appeared soft as flesh. His work cost small fortunes but added incomparable beauty. James Thornhill painted the Great Hall ceiling in 1716 for £978. The massive painting showed Marlborough kneeling to Britannia, proffering a map of the Battle of Blenheim. Britannia accepts the map while Marlborough's victories unfold around them. The scale required Thornhill to work from scaffolding erected specifically for the project. The saloon ceiling received paintings by Louis Laguerre for £500. Duchess Sarah had negotiated this lower price, demonstrating her constant awareness that costs spiraled beyond control. Laguerre painted the triumph of the Duke of Marlborough, showing the Duke in apotheosis, ascending toward glory, while defeated French standards lay beneath. It was magnificent propaganda art, exactly what the building demanded. But even at £500, it represented money the family increasingly could not afford. The suite of staterooms on the Piano Nobile were designed to be overpowering displays rather than warm or comfortable spaces. Not spaces where people would want to spend time, spaces designed to intimidate, to impress, to announce power. Vanbrugh understood his remit. This was not a house, but a monument. The difference mattered. Houses serve the people living in them. Monuments serve abstract ideals. Blenheim was monument first, dwelling second. This prioritization created friction with the Duchess from the beginning. The long library eventually stretched 180 feet, the entire length of the West Wing. It was designed to hold thousands of books, though initially the family owned few volumes to fill it. The later Sunderland Library, one of England's finest private book collections, would occupy this space until the 7th Duke was forced to sell it in 1880 to pay debts. The staterooms flowed through one another in processional sequence. Red drawing room, green writing room, state bedroom, each room connected to the next, through double doors that could stand open during receptions, creating vistas stretching hundreds of feet. Everything announced magnificence, nothing conceded to domestic comfort. This was deliberate. Vanbrugh knew what he was creating. The nation wanted a monument to British military triumph. The building had to overwhelm visitors, had to make them understand Britain's power and wealth. If the Duke and Duchess found the palace uncomfortable to live in, that was unfortunate, but secondary. The primary purpose was symbolic. The building said, "Britain has arrived as great power. Britain's generals defeat Europe's greatest armies. Britain rewards its heroes with buildings that rival anything in France or Italy." This message was worth any cost. Or so the thinking went when planning began in 1705. The problems arose from what was demanded. Vanbrugh received contradictory instructions. Create a monument, but also create a home. Satisfy the nation's desire for grandeur, but satisfy the Duchess's need for practicality. Keep costs under control, but spare no expense in creating magnificence. These contradictions made the project impossible from the beginning, and in the early days of building, the Duke was frequently away on military campaigns. It was left to the Duchess to negotiate with Vanbrugh. Sarah was more aware than her husband of the precarious state of financial aid they were receiving. She attempted to curb Vanbrugh's grandiose ideas. She did this in an arrogant fashion, as was her nature, rather than explain the true reasons behind her frugality. Vanbrugh saw interference. Sarah saw a necessity. The two clashed constantly. Sarah later wrote, "I made Mr. Vanbrugh my enemy by the constant disputes I had with him to prevent his extravagance. The Duchess wanted the historic ruins of Woodstock Manor preserved and made into a landscape feature. Vanbrugh, an early conservationist, agreed enthusiastically. The Duchess changed her mind and had the ruins demolished. Vanbrugh protested. The Duchess won. The Duchess questioned every design decision. Why such large windows? Why such massive walls? Why such elaborate decoration? Vanbrugh defended his choices. Each feature served the building's purpose as national monument. But the Duchess saw waste. She saw money draining into stone and gilt when her husband was funding much of the work from his own limited resources. Because the Duke was not rich. He was a career soldier, a successful commander, but soldiers did not grow wealthy through military service. His income came from estates and from government positions. But maintaining Blenheim consumed that income faster than it arrived. The Duke had expected Parliament and Crown to pay. When that funding proved unreliable, he had to pay himself. By 1710, he had spent enormous sums. The building was far from complete, and political circumstances were changing. The relationship between Queen Anne and Duchess Sarah had soured. Years of Sarah's domineering behaviour had worn away Anne's affection. The two women quarrelled frequently. Sarah told the Queen exactly what she thought, without tact or deference. On one occasion during a heated argument, Sarah told the Queen to be quiet. This was not how one addressed a monarch. The friendship that had given the Marlboroughs their power was disintegrating, and with it, funding for Blenheim was disappearing. In 1711, the relationship between Queen and Duchess finally collapsed. Sarah lost her position as mistress of the robes. More importantly, she lost her influence over Anne. In summer of 1712, the Queen ceased all further payments for palace construction. Parliament followed the Queen's lead. Funding stopped completely. Nearly £300,000 had been spent to that point. The palace was perhaps two-thirds complete. No money remained to finish it. The Marlboroughs faced disaster. They could abandon the unfinished palace, wasting everything already spent, or they could complete it themselves, consuming their own limited resources. They chose to finish it, but this meant the Duke had to find cheaper craftsmen, men who would accept lower wages. Work that had been done with the finest materials and highest skill now had to be done more cheaply. Quality suffered. The Duchess' arguments with Vanbrugh intensified. The Marlboroughs went into exile in 1712. The political climate had turned against them. They left England and did not return until after Queen Anne's death in August 1714. When they returned, they found work on the palace had stopped completely. Craftsmen had left. The site stood silent. They had to restart everything, hire new workers, order new materials. The Duke was now 64 years old and in declining health. In 1716, the Duke suffered a massive stroke. He survived, but was severely weakened. Sarah took control of the building project. She fired Vanbrugh's expensive craftsmen and hired cheaper replacements. She questioned every expense. She demanded economies. Vanbrugh, already frustrated by years of interference, found working with Sarah impossible. The arguments became vicious. Sarah accused Vanbrugh of extravagance, impracticality, and deliberate waste. Vanbrugh accused Sarah of intolerable treatment. He said she prevented him from achieving the architectural vision the building demanded. Following their final altercation in November 1716, Vanbrugh resigned. He would never trouble her more, he wrote, unless the Duke recovered enough to shelter him from such intolerable treatment. Sarah banned him from the site. Vanbrugh, who had designed this massive building, who had overseen its construction for 11 years, was forbidden to enter the grounds. The palace was completed by Nicholas Hawksmoor, Vanbrugh's architectural associate. Hawksmoor worked efficiently and economically. He knew the design, he understood what needed finishing, and he did not argue with the Duchess. In 1719, while the Duchess was away, Vanbrugh secretly viewed the palace. He had to see his creation, even if forbidden. The building was nearly complete. The massive blocks of yellow stone rose from the Oxfordshire countryside like a city, not a house. The great hall with its 67-foot ceiling, the staterooms in their Baroque magnificence, the grand bridge crossing what would become a lake. Everything Vanbrugh had imagined was taking form, but he would never be acknowledged for creating it. The Duchess's anger had erased his name from the achievement. In 1725, when the palace opened to the public, Vanbrugh and his wife attempted to visit as tourists. They were refused admission, refused even to enter the park. The Duchess's orders were absolute. The architect who had designed Blenheim Palace, one of the finest examples of English Baroque architecture, was barred from seeing the completed building. When Vanbrugh died in 1726, satirist Abel Evans suggested this epitaph: "Under this stone, reader, survey, dead Sir John Vanbrugh's house of clay. Lie heavy on him, earth, for he laid many heavy loads on thee." The Duke never saw Blenheim completed. In 1722, John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, died at age 72. He had won great victories. He had been rewarded with a palace, but he had never lived in it as a finished building. He had spent 17 years watching it rise, fighting for funding, consuming his own wealth to complete it. The building that was meant to honour his triumph became a burden that troubled his final years. He was initially buried at Westminster Abbey. Later, his coffin was moved to Blenheim and placed in the chapel. The Duchess commissioned a massive tomb designed by William Kent, costing £2,200. Statues of the Duke and Duchess, depicted as Caesar and Caesarina, adorned the great sarcophagus. In bas relief at the tomb's base, the Duchess depicted the surrender of Marshal Tallard. When Sarah died in 1744, at age 84, her coffin was placed beside her husband's. Blenheim had become what Vanbrugh intended, a mausoleum as well as a palace, a monument to military victory, a shrine to a marriage that had shaped British politics, and a warning about the costs of grandeur. The total cost of completing Blenheim Palace reached £300,000, equivalent to approximately £25 million in modern money. This was triple the original estimate of £100,000. The Duke had contributed at least £60,000 from his own resources, probably more. The exact accounting was never clear. The Crown had contributed funds sporadically until 1712. The final burden fell on the first Duke and Duchess, who finished the work themselves at enormous personal cost. But completing the building was only the beginning. Operating Blenheim required constant expenditure. The palace had 187 rooms. Heating them was nearly impossible with 18th century technology. Each major room needed fireplaces. Chimneys required constant maintenance. Fuel had to be purchased. Staff had to be hired. The servant hierarchy at a ducal palace was elaborate. Butler, housekeeper, footman, maids, cooks, kitchen staff, stable hands, gardeners, gamekeepers. Each person required wages, housing, and food. The grounds needed maintaining. Formal gardens laid out by Henry Wise, Queen Anne's gardener, required teams of gardeners. The park needed gamekeepers to manage deer and pheasants for hunting. The buildings needed constant repairs. Roofs leaked, stone weathered, windows cracked, plaster fell. Paint faded. Every year brought new expenses. Annual operating costs reached levels that strained even ducal incomes. The Marlboroughs lived comfortably after the palace's completion. Not lavishly, but comfortably. The second Duke, third Duke, and fourth Duke each managed Blenheim without disaster, but they could not accumulate wealth. The palace consumed income as quickly as estates generated it. Then came the fifth Duke of Marlborough, George Spencer Churchill. He inherited in 1817. Within 23 years, he had squandered the remaining family fortune. The fifth Duke spent recklessly. He gambled, he entertained extravagantly, he purchased art and objects without regard for cost. He made poor investments. He borrowed against future income. The estates that supported Blenheim generated less revenue as British agriculture entered depression. American grain imports undercut British farm prices. Rents fell. Income declined, but expenses continued. Blenheim required the same maintenance regardless of income. The fifth Duke could not or would not economize. By the time he died in 1840, his family had to leave the palace because they could not afford to live there. The sixth Duke inherited chaos. Debts exceeded income. The palace was decaying. Repairs had been deferred. The situation was dire. The seventh Duke of Marlborough inherited in 1857. He began selling assets to stay solvent. In 1875, he started selling items from Blenheim itself: furniture, paintings, objects accumulated over generations. It was not enough, and he was not permitted to sell certain protected items. The palace was entailed, meaning it could not be sold or broken up. It had to pass intact to the next heir. In 1880, the seventh Duke petitioned Parliament to remove the protective entail. Parliament agreed with the Blenheim Settled Estates Act, 1880. This made possible the liquidation of Blenheim and its contents. The great Sunderland Library was sold for vast sums of money, still not enough. The debts remained. The palace crumbled. The family's financial situation grew desperate. When the eighth Duke inherited in 1883, he faced the same problems: massive estate, insufficient income, mounting debts, expensive palace requiring constant maintenance. The eighth Duke married in 1888. His bride was the widowed Mrs. Louis C. Hamersley, an American. Part of her estimated $5 million fortune was applied to repair the roof at Blenheim and pay some of the Duke's debts. But debts continued mounting. When the eighth Duke died in 1892, his son, by his first marriage, faced complete disaster. Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill became ninth Duke of Marlborough at 21 years old. He inherited a near-bankrupt dukedom in 1892. The ninth Duke was forced to find a quick and drastic solution. Prevented by strict social dictates of late 19th century society from earning money through work, he was left with one option. He had to marry wealth. Specifically, he had to marry American wealth. This was becoming common among British aristocracy. American industrialists had created enormous fortunes during the Gilded Age. Their daughters wanted titles and position in European society. British aristocrats needed money to maintain their crumbling estates. Marriages were arranged. Dollars for dukedom. The matchmaker was Lady Paget, born Mary Minnie Stevens, daughter of an American hotel entrepreneur. Lady Paget introduced eligible American heiresses to British noblemen for a fee. She was essentially an international marriage agent. She introduced the ninth Duke to Consuelo Vanderbilt, only daughter of railroad millionaire William Vanderbilt and his ambitious wife Alva. Consuelo was 17 years old, beautiful, accomplished, well-educated, and worth millions. Consuelo did not want to marry the Duke. She was secretly engaged to Winthrop Rutherford, an American socialite, 15 years her senior. But Alva Vanderbilt was determined to see her daughter become a duchess. Alva had divorced Consuelo's father and needed to secure her own social position. Marrying Consuelo into European aristocracy would do that. Alva fought ruthlessly to force the marriage. First, she threatened to have Rutherford murdered. Then, she pretended Consuelo's disobedience was literally killing her. According to Consuelo, she was locked in her room until she agreed to marry the Duke. The negotiations were lengthy and mercenary. The final settlement was $2.5 million in 50,000 shares of Beech Creek Railway Company stock, with minimum 4% dividend guaranteed by New York Central Railroad Company. Both bride and groom would each receive additional annual income of $100,000 for life. Over the course of the marriage, Vanderbilt family contributions totaled an estimated $15 to $20 million. The contract was signed in the vestry of St. Thomas Episcopal Church immediately after the wedding vows, November the 6th, 1895. The wedding made front pages of every newspaper. Alva had aroused press curiosity by revealing details in advance. Diamond garters the bride would wear under her wedding dress, a 5-meter train costing $7,000. 300 policemen lined the street. Thousands of spectators gathered. Inside the church, New York society watched. Consuelo approached the altar weeping behind her veil. The Duke arrived late from final negotiations. Neither loved the other. The Duke later told Consuelo during their honeymoon that he had married her only because he felt obliged to save Blenheim. The newlyweds honeymooned in Europe, travelling through France and Italy in ceremonial procession. Then they travelled to England and Blenheim. Consuelo saw for the first time the palace her fortune would save. The approach through Woodstock Park revealed the massive yellow stone structure rising from Oxfordshire countryside. 187 rooms spread across 3 blocks, formal gardens stretching before the facade, vast park with ancient trees and wandering deer. From a distance, it was impressive, a city of stone rather than a single building. Close up, it was overwhelming. The interior was cold, despite dozens of fireplaces. The rooms were vast, designed for display rather than comfort. High ceilings meant heat rose away from occupants. The windows, tall and numerous, let in drafts along with the light. The passages between rooms were long and echoed with footsteps. Moving from bedroom to breakfast room required walking significant distances through corridors where servants waited silently. Privacy was impossible. 40 servants observed every movement, reported every word, maintained the machinery of ducal life. The Duke wasted no time spending Consuelo's dowry. He extensively restored Blenheim Palace according to plans long delayed by lack of funds. Roofs were repaired or replaced. Sections showing water damage received new plasterwork. Rooms that had been empty for years were redecorated. He purchased furnishings and fabrics from Paris, travelling there specifically to select items himself. The finest French furniture, the best fabrics, tapestries, carpets, everything needed to make the staterooms worthy of their architecture. He expanded the formal gardens, hiring additional gardeners and purchasing plants from specialist nurseries. He rebuilt portions of the library to accommodate the remaining books after the Sunderland Library's sale. Everything that had decayed over decades was renewed. The work consumed money at remarkable pace. Hundreds of thousands of dollars disappeared into stone and wood and gilt. Consuelo watched her family's fortune flow into a building she had not chosen and did not particularly love. She understood the necessity. Without American money, Blenheim would crumble. The 7th Duke's grandmother, Fanny, had made it clear to the 9th Duke that he needed to save Blenheim. He had effectively entered into arranged marriage as duty to his family and title. But understanding necessity did not make it less bitter. Consuelo became Duchess of Marlborough and assumed her duties with grace that surprised even the Duke's family. She oversaw the household, a complex organization requiring constant management. She supervised the housekeeper, who managed female servants. She dealt with the butler, who managed male servants. She reviewed menus prepared by the cook, planned entertainments for guests, managed correspondence, received callers. The social demands were exhausting. As Duchess of Marlborough, Consuelo ranked among the highest nobility in Britain. She was expected to maintain standards befitting that position. She managed the servants, 40 people living at Blenheim in various capacities. The hierarchy was rigid and ancient. Butler at top of male servants responsible for wine cellars, silver, and receiving guests. Housekeeper at top of female servants managing housemaids, linens, and household supplies. Below them ranked footmen in their livery, housemaids in their uniforms, kitchen maids, scullery maids, laundry maids. Each had specific duties, specific hours, specific place in the order. Below stairs in the service wing, the world ran according to rules as inflexible as those governing nobility above stairs. She visited tenants on the estate, performing the charitable duties expected of Duchess. The Marlborough estates included farmland, cottages, entire villages. Tenants paid rent to the Duke. In return, they expected certain benevolence. When tenant families faced illness or hardship, the Duchess was expected to provide assistance. Consuelo took these duties seriously. She visited cottages, bringing food and medicine. She spoke with tenant children, ensuring they had adequate clothing for winter. She established programs to help mothers and infants. She became genuinely concerned with improving lives of those dependent on Marlborough estates. She became involved in philanthropic projects beyond the estate, taking special interest in those concerning mothers and children. She worked with organisations in Oxford promoting maternal health. She funded programmes teaching childcare to working-class mothers. She used her position and wealth to advance causes she believed in. This work gave her purpose beyond the empty, ceremonial demands of aristocratic life. It also allowed her to escape Blenheim's oppressive atmosphere for hours at a time. She bore 2 sons, as expected. Producing an heir was her primary duty as Duchess. John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, born September 18, 1897, in London. The birth was attended by doctors, nurses, and considerable anxiety. If Consuelo failed to produce a male heir, the dukedom would pass to Winston Churchill, the Duke's cousin. Winston himself was present at Blenheim frequently, part of the young circle surrounding the family. The pressure on Consuelo to deliver a son was immense. When John Albert was born healthy, relief was universal. The line was secured. Lord Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill was born October 14, 1898, in Mayfair. With 2 sons, Consuelo had fulfilled her obligation. She famously coined the phrase, an heir and a spare, to describe her sons, a phrase that would enter common usage. The boys were raised primarily by nurses and tutors under Consuelo's supervision. She saw them daily but did not raise them herself in the modern sense. That was not how ducal families operated. Children belonged to the family line, not to individual parents. They were being prepared for roles they would inherit. But the marriage was unhappy from the beginning and grew worse over time. The Duke was surly, critical, suspicious. He possessed no intellectual qualities that might have compensated for his difficult personality. He and Consuelo had nothing in common. He cared about the estate, about racing, about traditional aristocratic pursuits. She cared about books, about art, about social reform. They lived separate lives within Blenheim's vast rooms. She occupied her apartments in one wing. He occupied his in another. They met for formal meals and required social occasions. Otherwise, they avoided each other. The nervous tension that tends to grow between people of different temperament condemned to live together reached its highest peak. Consuelo later wrote these words in her autobiography. The understatement was characteristic. She never described the marriage in truly bitter terms, though bitterness would have been justified. She maintained dignity even when recounting years of unhappiness. But the careful phrases revealed much. Life together had not brought us closer. Time had but accentuated our differences. These were the words of someone who had endured imprisonment, disguised as marriage. Consuelo found friendship with the Duke's cousin, Winston Churchill, born at Blenheim in 1874. Winston was exactly her age, also born in November. He was the life and soul of the young and brilliant circle that gathered round him at Blenheim. Whether it was his American blood, his mother being American-born Jenny Jerome, or his boyish enthusiasm and spontaneity, qualities sadly lacking in my husband. Consuelo wrote, I delighted in his companionship. Winston understood her situation. He had watched his own mother navigate difficult marriage to Lord Randolph Churchill. He saw how Consuelo struggled with the Duke's coldness and the palace's oppressive grandeur. Winston became her confidant, her friend, her ally. The Duke began an affair in the late 1890s with Gladys Deacon, another American beauty living in Europe. Gladys was younger than Consuelo, celebrated for her beauty and intelligence. Marcel Proust said of Gladys, I never saw a girl with such beauty, such magnificent intelligence, such goodness and charm. The Duke brought Gladys to Blenheim repeatedly. Astonishingly, Gladys was invited by Consuelo herself, who befriended her. The two women remained friends despite Gladys's relationship with the Duke. Perhaps Consuelo was relieved that her husband's attention was directed elsewhere. Perhaps she genuinely liked Gladys, who was lively and interesting in ways the Duke was not. Perhaps she simply accepted that aristocratic marriages functioned this way. In 1906, after 11 years of marriage, Consuelo shocked society by leaving the Duke. They separated, officially. She took up residence at Sunderland House, the Mayfair Palace her father had built for the Marlboroughs. Winston Churchill acted as an ally in negotiating the separation. The Duke and Duchess did not divorce until 1921. To facilitate divorce, Alva Vanderbilt testified that she had coerced her daughter into marriage. Alva told an investigator, I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter. The marriage was annulled by the Vatican on August 19, 1926. The Duke wished to convert to Roman Catholicism. Consuelo married French aviator Jacques Balsan in 1921. It was, in Consuelo's words, a marriage of love. She lived happily between France, Florida, and New York until her death in 1964. The ninth Duke married Gladys Deacon shortly after divorcing Consuelo. This marriage proved even more disastrous. Gladys had ruined her beauty by injecting her face with paraffin wax. She became increasingly unstable. She dined with the Duke with a revolver by the side of her plate. The Duke was forced to close Blenheim temporarily and turn off utilities to drive her out. They separated, but never divorced. The ninth Duke died of cancer on June 30th, 1934, aged 63. Despite the personal disasters, the ninth Duke had saved Blenheim. Consuelo's fortune paid for renovations that preserved the building for another generation. Her taste improved the interiors. Her money purchased furnishings and fabrics that restored elegance to rooms that had been empty or shabby. Without Consuelo Vanderbilt, Blenheim would have fallen into irreversible decay. The palace survived because an American heiress was forced into marriage with a man she did not love to save a building her husband's family could not afford. This pattern repeated across British aristocracy. American heiresses marrying British noblemen, dollars flowing across Atlantic to prop up crumbling estates. At least 9 American girls made such marriages in 1895 alone. The New York Times periodically printed lists of sums changing hands. Hundreds of millions of dollars left America to save British country houses. It was economic necessity disguised as social climbing. British aristocrats needed capital. American industrialists wanted titles. Daughters paid the price. The irony of Blenheim is profound. Built as national monument to military victory, it became a financial burden that destroyed the family it was meant to honour. 300 years of Churchills have lived at Blenheim. Each generation struggled with the same problem: insufficient income to maintain immense palace. Each generation found temporary solutions: sell assets, marry money, open to tourists. But the fundamental problem never changed. Blenheim was built without regard for long-term costs. It was designed to impress, not to sustain, and sustaining it has consumed fortunes. Today, Blenheim Palace remains the home of the 12th Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. Charles James Spencer Churchill inherited the title in 2014 when his father, the 11th Duke, died at age 88. The 12th Duke was 58 when he inherited, old enough to understand fully what inheritance meant. Not merely title and palace, but responsibility and burden. The palace he inherited was both treasure and trap, priceless asset and bottomless expense. But the palace survives primarily as tourist attraction and commercial venue rather than as private family home. The family occupies private apartments in one section, while the rest opens to public. Over 50,000 people visit annually for tours of staterooms. During summer months, when the Duke is not in residence, the formal apartments receive paying visitors who walk through spaces designed 300 years ago for exclusive aristocratic use. They see the Great Hall, where Marlborough appears on Thornhill's ceiling, the staterooms with their Baroque magnificence, the long library where the Sunderland collection once stood, the chapel with Kent's massive tomb. Visitors pay admission fees that contribute to palace maintenance but do not come close to covering full costs. Beyond tours, Blenheim hosts events throughout the year: corporate functions in staterooms, weddings in formal gardens, concerts in the Great Court, Christmas markets, food festivals, anything that generates revenue without damaging the historic fabric. The palace that was built as monument to military victory and exclusive aristocratic power now operates as event venue and tourist destination. The transformation from private palace to semi-public attraction has been necessary for survival. The costs continue relentlessly, year after year, generation after generation. Maintaining 187 rooms requires constant work that never ends. Heating remains challenging despite modern systems. The vast spaces and high ceilings mean enormous energy consumption during cold months. British winters are mild compared to continental Europe, but still require heating from October through April. The utility bills alone reach staggering amounts. Lighting throughout the palace during operating hours consumes significant electricity. Security systems monitoring valuable artworks and furnishings. Climate control protecting paintings and tapestries from humidity damage. Staff salaries consume substantial portions of annual budget. Curators managing the art collection. Guides conducting tours. Security staff protecting the building and its contents. Maintenance workers handling daily repairs. Gardeners maintaining the formal gardens and parkland. Administrative staff managing bookings, finances, marketing. Each person requires salary, benefits, training, supervision. The modern Blenheim employs dozens, far fewer than the 40 or more servants Consuelo managed, but still requiring significant payroll. Insurance costs reflect the palace's value. The building itself is irreplaceable. The contents include paintings by Van Dyck, Rubens, Reynolds, Sargent, furniture from finest craftsmen, tapestries depicting Marlborough's victories, books in the remaining library, silver, porcelain, sculptures. The total value reaches hundreds of millions of pounds. Ensuring this collection against fire, theft, damage requires premiums that would buy comfortable houses for ordinary families. But without insurance, a single disaster could be financially catastrophic. Repairs to roof, walls, windows, floors happen constantly. 300-year-old buildings develop problems continuously. Water infiltration damages plaster, stone weathering requires replacement. Windows warp and need attention. Floors develop structural issues. The palace was built with 18th century technology and materials. Maintaining it requires understanding those original methods while incorporating modern techniques where possible. Finding craftsmen who can work on historic buildings becomes increasingly difficult. Training new craftsmen costs money. Everything costs money. Preservation of artworks, furniture, and books requires specialists. Paintings need regular inspection for signs of deterioration. Some require cleaning or restoration by conservators who train for years to work on historic art. Furniture suffers from age, use, and environmental conditions. Expert restorers repair and stabilize pieces. Books in the library need protection from light, humidity, insects, mold. Conservation librarians manage collection care. Each specialty requires hiring professionals who command appropriate salaries for rare skills. Maintenance of grounds, gardens, and lake adds additional expense. The formal gardens require teams of gardeners working year-round. Planting, pruning, maintaining lawns, managing herbaceous borders, protecting against pests and diseases. The parkland spreads over 2,000 acres, requiring management of woodlands, maintenance of paths, care of lake created by Capability Brown in 1764. The lake needs monitoring for water quality, management of aquatic plants, protection of wildlife habitat. Ancient trees throughout the park require arborists to assess health and safety. Diseased or dangerous trees must be removed carefully without damaging surroundings. Taxation continues as burden, though specific arrangements for historic properties provide some relief. The palace itself is not taxed as normal residents, but the Duke pays taxes on income generated from various sources. Death duties remain concern. When the 11th Duke died in 2014, death duties on the estate required careful financial management to avoid forcing sale of artworks or other assets. The 10th Duke's estate had faced similar challenges when he died in 1972. Death duties had forced payment of £175,000, considerable sum even then. Modern estimates suggest operating costs for Blenheim reach several £1 million annually. Exact figures are not published, but comparisons with similar properties suggest minimum £3 to £5 million per year for basic operations, maintenance, and staffing. Major repair projects, which occur regularly, add hundreds of thousands or millions more. A comprehensive roof renovation might cost £2 million. Restoring damaged stonework on one facade could reach £1 million. These are not one-time expenses, but recurring needs. What is repaired today will need repair again in 20 or 30 years. Even with admission fees from 50,000 annual visitors, events throughout the year, commercial activities like weddings and corporate functions, and private family wealth covering expenses remains constant challenge. The 12th Duke inherited not just palace and title, but responsibility for maintaining one of Britain's most important historic buildings. He cannot simply walk away. He cannot sell the palace. The entailment and UNESCO designation impose obligations. He is custodian of World Heritage, position that brings prestige but also burden that never ends. The family adapted to circumstances in ways earlier dukes would have found unimaginable. They occupy private apartments representing small fraction of palace's total space. The grand staterooms are no longer for family use but for paying visitors. The formal dining room where Consuelo endured meals with the 9th Duke now hosts corporate dinners where companies pay thousands of pounds for privilege. The bedrooms where successive duchesses slept are roped off behind barriers, viewed by tourists from doorways. The transformation from exclusive private residence to semi-public space happened gradually over decades, necessity driving each compromise. The 12th Duke and Duchess participate in commercial aspects that sustain the palace. They attend corporate events, welcome wedding parties, appear at charity functions held at Blenheim. This is not optional. The palace survives through these activities. Without commercial revenue, the costs would overwhelm any private income. The Duke becomes, in essence, manager of heritage property as much as owner of private home. The distinction between personal property and national monument blurs. The family lives at Blenheim, but does not fully own it in practical sense. They are bound to it as much as it belongs to them. The irony is profound and multi-layered. John Churchill won military victory and received reward that became burden. He built monument that bankrupted his descendants. 300 years of Churchills have struggled with fundamental problem that cannot be solved: insufficient income to maintain immense palace without external support. Each generation found temporary solutions: sell assets, marry money, open to tourists, commercialize operations. But fundamental problem persists. Blenheim was built without regard for long-term costs. It was designed to impress, not sustain. And sustaining it has consumed fortunes, destroyed marriages, and trapped families in gilded cage of their own ancestral glory. Blenheim Palace was designated UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987. The designation recognized its outstanding universal value as masterpiece of English Baroque architecture and as monument to exceptional historical significance. UNESCO cited the palace as unique example of complete Baroque ensemble of palace, park, and gardens. The inscription noted that Blenheim represents the beginning of Romantic movement in landscape design through later work by Capability Brown. It stands as symbol of victory of forces led by Marlborough over French armies of Louis XIV. These are reasons for World Heritage status. But UNESCO designation does not come with funding. It adds prestige, attracts tourists, generates publicity, but it also imposes responsibilities that carry no budget. The building must be maintained to certain standards. Changes require approval from heritage authorities. The family cannot simply demolish expensive parts they cannot afford to maintain. They cannot neglect sections causing financial strain. They cannot make alterations that compromise historic character. They are custodians of world heritage, not merely owners of private property. The distinction matters legally and practically. The designation protects the palace from development or destruction, but does not solve the financial equation. If anything, it makes solving that equation harder. Commercial uses must respect heritage values. Modern interventions must be reversible. Any change must preserve what UNESCO recognized as outstanding universal value. These constraints are appropriate for protecting important monument, but they limit options for generating revenue or reducing costs. The family must maintain standards befitting World Heritage Site while finding ways to pay for that maintenance. The circle seems impossible to square. The 12th Duke inherited in 2014 following death of his father, the 11th Duke. The 11th Duke had managed Blenheim from 1972 to 2014, 42 years of stewardship. He had overseen conversion of palace into modern tourist attraction. He had developed commercial activities that sustain operations. He had maintained relationship with heritage authorities, managing regulations while pursuing necessary changes. His son inherited functioning operation, but one that requires constant management and adaptation. Nothing about running Blenheim is static or settled. Everything requires ongoing decisions, ongoing expenditure, ongoing compromises between preservation and practicality. The solutions involve commercialization that would have horrified the first Duke. Weddings are held at the palace, corporate events, film locations. The grounds host festivals, concerts, exhibitions, anything that generates revenue without damaging the building. This is the tragic story of Blenheim Palace. Not tragic because it failed, tragic because it succeeded too well. The building that was meant to announce British triumph became a burden that consumed every resource the family possessed. The monument that was supposed to honour the first Duke instead impoverished his descendants. The palace that was built without regard for cost imposed costs that never ended. Queen Anne's gift to her military hero was a poisoned chalice wrapped in Baroque splendour. Consuelo Vanderbilt wrote in her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold, about her years at Blenheim. The title captured everything. Beautiful surface, hard reality beneath. The palace glittered. The gold demanded from American heiresses was real. She saved Blenheim, but lost years of happiness to do it. Her mother forced the marriage. The Duke admitted he married for money. The palace consumed the fortune. This was the mathematics of aristocratic survival in the age of industrial capitalism. John Churchill won the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. For that victory, he received land and funding to build a palace. But the palace cost £300,000, triple the estimate. It took 17 years to complete. The Duke never lived in the finished building. The architect was banned from seeing his creation. The family spent the next century selling assets to stay solvent. The ninth Duke had to marry an American heiress to save it. That heiress spent decades in unhappy marriage to preserve a building she had not chosen and did not particularly like. This is how monuments are built. Not through wisdom or careful planning, but through ambition, overwhelming financial reality. The palace stands because abandoning it would mean admitting the waste. Each generation maintains what previous generations built, adding their own costs to the accumulated burden. The first Duke wanted a palace worthy of his victory. 2 centuries later, his descendant had to sell the family into American money to keep that palace standing. November 6, 1895. Morning light fell through stained glass windows. Consuelo Vanderbilt wept behind her veil. The Duke arrived late from negotiations. The price was set, $2.5 million to save Blenheim. An American fortune to preserve a British monument. Dollars for dukedom. Tragedy disguised as social triumph. The marriage that saved the palace destroyed the lives of those within it. If you enjoyed this investigation into the hidden costs behind aristocratic splendor, please like and subscribe. The next exploration awaits. Thank you for watching.